We're continuing the stories that Mark was telling on the journey that Jesus and the disciples were making to Jerusalem for Passover. Journeys usually take us away from what's most familiar. They take us into territories or situations that exercise our critical and analytical faculties. We usually compare where we are on our journey with what we're most familiar, or with what we hope for, or what we don't understand in relation to what we know. We wonder about difference. We wonder how to keep ourselves safe, how to make good choices, how to get a better understanding of what we're experiencing. Journeys provide us with those opportunities. John and I have just returned from a long journey to Crete. We've been to Crete before and find it a place very different from New Zealand. New Zealand being one of the most recent countries in the world to receive human habitation, and Crete one of the oldest. There's much to reflect on in the landscape of Crete, in the cultural priorities and the structures and social systems that give shape to the lives of the people who live there. Christianity has been in Crete since about 64 of the Common Era, way back. It was said that Paul visited Crete on his 4th missionary journey and appointed Titus, the first bishop, to bring some order to the lives of the people of Crete, and especially to those who would espouse Christianity. Paul seemed to have the impression that Cretans were rather disordered and rebellious people who needed to be brought into line. I'm not sure he achieved that, nor if the centuries since have achieved it. They still seem to me to be a people who have a sense of their own place, their own authority, with an impressive self-determination and a powerful set of cultural priorities shaped by their history. Mark sets this middle section of his narrative gospel within that journey of Jesus and his disciples on their way to Jerusalem for Passover. As with most journeys, nothing was stable. They were on the move, they were out of their comfort zones and wondering how to secure some structure and security for themselves. Last week, we heard this reflected in the petition of the rich man who ran up to Jesus asking how he could secure eternal life for himself. After all, he'd kept all the commandments all his life. He was doing the right thing. Jesus sent him away with an impossible task. The uncertainty of the setting and the anxiety reflected in the stories mirrors the social context that the writer of Mark's Gospel and his audience were experiencing about 70 AD, when that indestructible temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. There was great social upheaval during the time, including Emperor Nero's persecution. Safety and security were likely in the minds of those bearing the brunt of the persecution. And we know, now as then, in times of great social uncertainty and upheaval such as they were experiencing, there's much jockeying for position, for power, for influence. And Mark is reflecting on this, and he offers words of caution to those who are followers of Jesus. In the text for today, he writes, "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.' And Jesus says, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And they replied, 'Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in glory.'" In this passage, the disciples James and John ask Jesus for a place of honour. It's reasonable for them to expect Jesus, the leader of the group, to be able to elevate them to a position of glory or honour and prestige. As a leader, and within the relational expectations of the time, he could do this if he wanted to. In their request to sit at Jesus' right and left, they're showing their yearning for affirmation, for status and power, and for a sense of security. And we can identify with that. But Jesus responds with that radical redefinition of the glory or prestige they seek, the power and authority they hope for. He expands on what he hears them asking for by telling them that real power and authority do not come from positional authority or from appointments to seemingly powerful places in the structures of society. It does not come from positions of importance, from being able to access the services of others, of subordinates, or being able to tell them what they should be doing or thinking. Rather, it comes from serving others. It comes from working on their behalf, especially for the marginalised and the vulnerable. It comes with being recognised by others as someone who has the best interest of those others front of mind and heart, and more, being willing to do something to ensure their well-being. This teaching is as transformative today as it was then. It's as hard today for us as it was then. I've been reflecting on this while visiting Crete and walking through the ancient ruins of palaces and temples and mighty fortresses, immersed in the antiquity and history of the island. As I wondered on the one hand at the ancient civilizations of the Minoan and Mycenaean peoples and the Byzantium, Ottoman and Venetian empires that ruled Crete from time to time, on the one hand, and on the other hand, experienced the contemporary shared life of the community of a traditional mountain village, I was reminded of the contrast between worldly power and the justice-hearted love that Jesus calls us to embody. Greece's history and Crete's history is filled with stories of empires, kings and rulers vying for dominance. From the Minoan palaces of Knossos to the imposing fortresses built by the Venetians, power and prestige were often measured by grandeur of one's achievements. Yet, as I stood among the crumbling walls, I was impressed by how transient such power and glory is. The once great empires of Crete have long since faded, their leaders' names largely forgotten. What remains is not the power they wielded, but the legacy of the communities they built, the art they created, and the lives they impacted. And I wondered what legacy I would be leaving. In this light, Jesus' words take on a new resonance. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Jesus turns the concept of power upside down. The desire for status and influence, symbolized in James and John's request, is natural, but it's not the path that Jesus calls us to. Instead, Jesus points us towards a life of justice-making service, where the greatest honour is found not in lording it over others, but in lifting them up and working for their well-being. During my time in Crete, I was frequently moved by how the spirit of service and hospitality endures even today. This ancient ethos of welcoming the stranger, offering a meal, and sharing hospitality is deeply woven into the fabric of Cretan culture. It reflects the values that Jesus himself modeled, a love that transcends status and seeks to make a stranger a friend. Walking through the villages and eating in the village squares and meeting locals who generously offer what they have reminds me of Jesus feeding those who are hungry and sharing the wealth that is to be had. They do share my tomatoes for your olives, my wine for your oil. I'll help you press the grapes. You help me pick the olives. The people we were living amongst were not wealthy by our standards, but there was always a gift from the store of what they had. Oranges, eggs, olive oil, flowers, wine. It just appeared. This is radical hospitality. To share and to serve and to include is the greatness that Jesus speaks of. It is an act of love that quietly transforms both the one who serves, who gives, and the one who receives. And it's the heart of the gospel stories. In a world that often measures success by wealth, influence, and status, how can we, as followers of Jesus, embody this servant-hearted leadership? We're an Anglican community, and as such, I believe we're called to be both prophetic and pastoral. Our mission is not to seek positions of honour, but to be the hands and feet of Christ, working for justice, serving the marginalised and lifting the downtrodden. Like the ruins of Crete's mighty palaces and worldly power will eventually crumble, but the impact of community care and hospitality endures. And Jesus asks us to look beyond our own desires for recognition. The stories of Mark and the other gospel writers and the admonitions of Paul challenge us to see the needs of those around us and to do something, to be a voice for the voiceless, to care for the earth, acting in its best interests, to welcome the refugee and the stranger. Because this is what it means to drink the cup that he drank and to live the life poured out for others. So as I return here to our community at St. Matthew's, I do so thinking very hard about what it means to serve. The ruins of Crete have reminded me that our Christian witness is not about building monuments of greatness, but nurturing the relationships and the communities around us. Our call is to make visible the love of God through acts of service, however small they may seem, and by building relationships that demonstrate care and concern. I love it, and you can go home and read it, but I love it, that the very next incident in the story Mark is telling of that journey to Jerusalem, in that story, Jesus asks a blind beggar who's sitting on the side of the road and calls to him. He calls out, hassling Jesus, much to the annoyance of many. He calls out, and Jesus says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And this time, Jesus did as he was asked.